Welcome to CACOR's 218th Zoom webinar. I'm very honored to introduce our speaker for today. Ralph Torrie is a Director of Research for Corporate Knights, a Toronto-based media and research company. I've been following personally Corporate Knights for some time and have enjoyed Ralph's no-nonsense, independent, and evidence-based thinking. This is exemplified by his forecast for electricity demand growth in Ontario that are more reasonable and lower, actually, than anything else I've seen, but they're based on facts and real research. The subject of today is tariffs on Chinese-made EVs and their impact on Canada's ability to meet its climate targets. As some of you may know, we at the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa had sent our feedback indicating our opposition to the tariffs. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Ralph what he has to say about that, as I expect that our opinions are very similar. Reminder to please put your questions in the chat and we will answer those after the formal presentation. Ralph, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome for inviting me to share some ideas and some analysis that we've been doing on this question of the tariffs that Canada has imposed or is about to impose on the import of electric vehicles made in China. So I'm not going to be giving a presentation today on electric vehicles per se. I think you've had those before, and there are better experts to do that than myself. I'm going to be focused specifically on the bigger picture in terms of the role of electrifying vehicles in meeting our climate change targets and in the consequences of the tariff and the effect that it will have of basically barring affordable electric vehicles from Canadians' purchasing choices, at least until, if ever, the Western car industry is able to come up with similarly priced vehicles. I wanted to start by just reviewing a little bit about the context that we're in with respect to greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Most of you will already be familiar with this picture, but I think it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves at the onset of a conversation about the potential for electrification of vehicles to take a look at where the emissions in this country are coming from and what they've been doing over the past 22 years. One of the things they haven't been doing is going down. I think we all know that. The growth that has occurred has been modest. It's been driven largely by the growth in greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. The power sector is actually considerably below where it was 20 years ago, thanks largely to Ontario's backing out of coal, but the reduction of coal generation in the country continues to put downward pressure on the emission intensity of power generation in Canada. The buildings, both residential and commercial, which are the two layers at the bottom of this chart, have more or less held steady, which is actually remarkable in some ways in its own right, given the amount of growth that's occurred in both our residential and commercial building stock over the last quarter century. The transportation sector is represented by the red and the red patterned layers that are second and third from the top of the graph. The dark red being personal transportation, in other words, cars and SUVs and pickup trucks and so on. And the pattern red being the commercial vehicle sector, represented mainly by trucks, actually only by trucks. I'm only looking really at, mainly by trucks. This does include aviation and marine, which are relatively small contributors to the total. And there has been growth there. You can see the effect of the pandemic in 2020 with the decline in transportation-related emissions being the sector that was hit hardest by the effect that that pandemic had on our energy use patterns. It has been recovering since then, but is still not back to its pre-pandemic levels. I also wanted to just briefly put up a couple of different ways of looking at our emissions as more by way of context. What I've done here is the set of bars on the left-hand side of this graph show the conventional breakdown of our emissions, more or less the way that they were displayed in the previous chart, broken down by the residential and commercial buildings, the two green bars, followed by 3 bars representing industry and general manufacturing and some other miscellaneous things, followed by a gray sort of bar, which is the agricultural sector. And then we have our 2 transportation bars, the dark red and the pattern red for personal and commercial, followed by a gray bar for waste, and then a dark blue bar for the power sector and a yellow bar for all of those emissions from the oil and gas sector. In the right-hand side of the graph, the dark blue bar for the power sector and the bright yellow bar for the oil and gas sector are no longer present. The emissions from the power sector have been redistributed to the end users of the electricity, and the emissions from the oil and gas sector have similarly been redistributed to the end users of the oil and gas products. We do this all the time for electricity. We don't do it very often for oil and gas, but we really should if we want to allocate our emissions in a way that reflects the driving force behind this issue, which is the consumption of the fuel and electricity itself. What happens, interestingly, when you do this for Canada is that you end up with a great big bar at the right-hand side of the right set of bars, which basically represents greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from our oil and gas production sector to make products for mainly the United States. And the reason this is...
Could you advance your slides, please? You have not advanced the slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got it.
That's it. Thank you.
There we go. My apologies. Double screen problem. That's unfortunate because this slide is quite a bit going on. But as I was saying, the left-hand side represents the conventional allocation of emissions to the sector where they occur. And so there's a dark blue bar for power and a bright yellow bar for the oil and gas industry. The right-hand side, those bars allocate the emissions still to the end use sectors, but we take the power sector emissions and the oil and gas industry emissions and redistribute them to the end use sectors so that the power sector and the oil and gas industry no longer appear in the right-hand set of bars. And but we do end up with this 21% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada allocated to emissions that are really there because we are exporting oil and gas. And those emissions really fall outside of the reach of any demand side policies that we might take here in Canada. Just as an aside, partly because I know John Hollins is especially interested in this type of reallocation, when you allocate the greenhouse gas emissions not to their where they occur, but to where the end use of the energy takes place, it gives you a different picture by province than you normally get. And again, the left-hand bar is a conventional distribution with the emissions allocated to the province in which they occur. The right-hand bar allocates the emissions to the province or the jurisdiction in which the fuel and electricity is consumed. And so the power sector and the oil and gas sector emissions have been redistributed as they were in the previous one. And as you can see, and this is somewhat unique for Canada, a very significant percentage of our total greenhouse gas emissions are really driven by demand for fuel and electricity in the United States, which is outside of our reach. Okay, getting closer to the topic at hand, zeroing in on the transportation sector. Here you can see the pie of emissions that we've been looking at, and the emissions from the transportation sector broken down more or less evenly between the personal and the commercial segments. And you can see also the upstream oil and gas emissions have been added to this bar just to keep track of the fact that the emissions that any particular sector is responsible for, including transportation, extend not only to what comes out of the tailpipes, which is obviously the biggest term, but to all of those emissions that occur in the fossil fuel industry in order to produce and refine and deliver those transportation fuels to the vehicles. And there would be also a piece for electricity here if electricity mattered at this point in the transportation sector, but it's not really at the point where if I added it to this bar, you would even be able to see it. And that's obviously going to change as we electrify, but this is our starting point in terms of where the emissions are coming from in our transportation sector in Canada and how important they are relative to the total. It's interesting that if you take those export emissions out of the picture, those emissions that are for export of oil and gas, and look at Canada's emissions just in terms of those that are driven by our own end-use demand, now you see transportation rising to 33% of our total emissions, which is much more in line with its contribution to our total energy use. All of which is to say that you cannot crack the climate change problem in this country without decarbonizing the transportation sector. No matter how you slice and dice it, it's a very, very large and significant piece of our greenhouse gas emission profile. And the strategy for dealing with that is electrification. A little bit more by way of context in terms of the vehicle sector itself. Just some things to keep in mind as we move on to looking at the electric vehicle issue. Here you can see annual sales of personal vehicles in Canada from 2010 to 2013, with the dark blue bar on the left representing passenger cars and the light blue bar on the right representing all of the SUVs and crossovers and pickups.
So Ralph, can you move the slide, please?
Once again, I apologize. And so what some of you probably are aware of, and it's quite dramatic, is the decline in the relative share of cars compared to SUVs and crossovers and so on that's occurred in the past 13 years. Also interesting, if you look at the pandemic years, you can see that everything took a hit in 2020. Sales were down of both SUVs and cars. The SUVs have recovered, the cars have not. Cars are now down to something like 17% of total personal vehicle sales. And by cars, I mean sedans, down to about 17% of total vehicle sales. And they don't seem to be coming back after the pandemic hit. This looks to be a fairly entrenched pattern that's developed. Whether it will turn around again, I don't know. But for the time being, we have to assume going forward that the vehicles Canadians want to drive or have been taught to want to drive, for those of you who think that this was the result of a deliberate marketing strategy by the automobile industry, are now these much heavier and larger SUVs and crossovers and even pickup trucks that dominate the personal vehicle sales sector. As a percentage of the total fleet, cars are still in there at about 40-45%, but it's declining quickly because they're just not growing at the margin. By the way, this is also important. Vehicle sales in this country are completely dominated by the turnover of the existing fleet, not by the growth in the total number of cars being sold. And in this chart, what you can see now is the total personal vehicle registrations in Canada. And I've had to put this on a logarithmic scale in order to get the electric vehicles and the plug-in hybrids on the same chart with the red bars, which are the combustion vehicles. So you can see the combustion vehicles, and this is no longer sales that we're looking at. This is the total inventory on the road. The combustion vehicles are stalled actually at around 22, 23 million vehicles. In fact, interestingly, there's been a slight decline in the last couple of years, presumably reflecting affordability and the fact that some households evidently are downsizing from being 2-car or 3-car households to being 1 or 2-car households. So we're actually seeing an absolute decline in the total vehicle registrations in this country, and we haven't seen that for decades. However, even as that's going on, the battery electric vehicles are growing exponentially. They're still only 1.3% of all of the vehicles on the road in Canada, even though as a percentage of sales, they're much higher. They're up over 10% now nationally. Another interesting trend is that the battery electric vehicles now outnumber the plug-in hybrids 2 to 1. And the plug-in hybrid growth is falling off quite noticeably, while the battery electric vehicle growth curve is continuing fairly aggressively. So you can see we've got about 130,000. I'm sorry, this is logarithmic. We've got about 330,000 battery electric vehicles on the road in Canada, but that's in a population of personal vehicles that's in the range of 24 million. So it's a fast-growing but still fairly faint signal. For those of you who are into systems, complex systems development, you'll know that a fast-growing signal, even though it's small, can be the thing that's really driving the system dynamics, which I think is probably the case at this point in the car sector. So we've been looking at what it would cost to electrify all of those 24 million personal vehicles. In fact, we've been looking at all of the costs of electrifying the transportation sector in Canada, including building the charging network we need and including electrifying all of the trucks. And it's a big job. You know, this is a picture of rush hour on the 401 in Toronto right around this time of year. And Canadians drive a lot. We drive 400 billion kilometers in our cars every year. And it's going to take a significant investment at the current premiums that are being charged for electric vehicles in order to convert that stock over to electricity. At the rate that we're going, we won't get there. We won't meet the government's target for 2035 of 100% electric vehicle cells, and we won't meet the target to have carbon right out of this sector by 2050. We need to increase the pace by somewhere around a factor of, 4 or 5 as compared to the pace that we're going at now. It would be a good thing to do from an economic point of view, even when it's narrowly defined to include only the direct energy benefits and the carbon benefits and the maintenance savings. You'd still come out ahead with electrification, even if the premiums for the EVs stay more or less where they are now, you know, in that $10,000 to $20,000 range. And this is a key point when we turn to address this question of the Chinese electric vehicles and their prices, is that the cost and the speed with which we can decarbonize the personal vehicle sector in this country and the prospects for meeting the targets that we've set for ourselves for 2035 and 2050 are more sensitive to the premium on the sticker price of the electric vehicles than on any of the other factors involved. If we can bring down the cost of the electric vehicles, we will see a surge in the growth rate of their uptake. We know this from what we've seen in other countries. It's just common economic sense. And most recently, we've seen the analysis from the Parliamentary Budget Office that said it looks like, in spite of the fact that on a purely economic and analytical basis, the life cycle cost of owning an electric vehicle is now lower than the lifetime cost of owning a fuel vehicle. Most Canadians will still opt for the fuel vehicle in the showroom because of the sticker price, and that the sticker price needs to come down about 30% in order for the uptake to really start to accelerate. In other words, we need to see electric vehicles at price parity with gasoline vehicles in order to accelerate the uptake of these vehicles to the pace that's required to meet our GHG reduction targets. In a nutshell, it was interesting because the PBO analysis was really looking at what the total lifetime cost would have to do for Canadians to be motivated to make the switch. And by coincidence, their conclusion was basically equivalent to the electric vehicles reaching price parity with the internal combustion vehicles. Fundamentally, there's no reason why electric vehicles, in the long term at least, should cost more than fossil fuel vehicles. They have many fewer parts. By the nature of the technology and the way it's been developed, they are made with very efficient production technologies. This is probably nowhere more true than it is in China, where nearly 20 years ago, they deliberately made a decision not to try and become a world powerhouse of combustion vehicle manufacture, but to leapfrog ahead and focus on the electric vehicle as a key component of their economic development and technological development strategy. And they went at it with a vengeance. They bought up rights to the minerals that were needed for the batteries. They poured a ton of government money into the research and development of the technologies that were needed, subsidies which actually are not higher, in fact, are somewhat lower than what Canada's been doing in the last few years, but which are nevertheless very large in an absolute sense, probably a couple of $100 billion, most of which was like 10 years ago or more. And they are now reaping the benefits of having done that. They are producing these beautiful electric vehicles. And if you read the reviews of these cars in the car magazines, you will see that perhaps unlike the onset of the Japanese vehicles in the North American market, which many of us can remember, and they were pretty cheap, and they weren't really up to North American standards that the North American consumers were looking for. All indications and all reviews are that the Chinese are producing electric vehicles which are meeting both the aesthetic and the quality and the safety standards demanded by European car buyers and presumably would be by North American if we were allowed to buy them. So and they're growing by leaps and bounds. They're establishing factories in many developing countries. They are building factories around the periphery of Western Europe to produce cars for the European market. And the Chinese electric vehicle output now dominates the electric vehicle production in the world, as they have done interestingly for solar panels and wind turbines and other key components of the energy transition underway. So what you're looking at here is just a selection of cars that were available this summer on the market in Australia. That's where I looked. Interestingly, Australia has a free trade agreement with China, and so the cars come in without tariffs. We have a 6% tariff before the Chinese 100% tariff is being imposed. We had a 6% tariff on incoming vehicles. And the difference between the Australian and the Canadian dollars, by coincidence, is also about 6% at the time. So you can look at these prices, which are in Australian dollars, and read them pretty much as what these cars would probably be sold for if they were available in Canada. And you can see that there's a range, and that the price range itself from 26,000 up to 60,000 goes to a much lower level than what you will find if you went shopping for an electric vehicle in Canada today, where you really won't find anything below $40,000. So the Chinese have succeeded in producing, and they, by the way, they're producing these vehicles for much less than these prices. They are they're not really trying to maximize their sales in the countries they're moving in. They're trying to maximize their revenue. So they're pricing the cars at what they need to price them at in order to take business away from the combustion, similarly sized and similar quality combustion vehicles. In other words, price parity. What the Chinese have achieved with the electric vehicle is the ability to sell a car which looks and feels and is about the same size as its combustion counterpart for the same price or even $1,000 or $2,000 less. If you look at the premium seal up there in the right-hand corner at $60,000 Australian, that would give any Tesla a run for its money. If you look at some of these cheaper cars, 27, 30,000, these are basically electric versions of the smaller crossovers that are so popular in the North American market. So that's where the real potential is. If these vehicles were available in Canada, then families who cannot shop for a $50,000 or $60,000 vehicle, who are shopping for a vehicle between $25,000 and $40,000 would have options available to go electric that they do not have now because these cars are being shut out of the Canadian market. So there is absolutely no question that if these vehicles were to enter the Canadian market, they would be, they would sell fairly well. Some people would not buy them for the same reasons that some people would not and perhaps would still not buy Japanese cars when they first entered the North American market. But the evidence is in the countries where they have come in is overwhelmingly that brand loyalty among car buyers is very low at this point, and that if you offer them a quality Chinese electric vehicle at a price that's comparable to a combustion vehicle of the same size and standard, many of them would buy electric. They're ready to buy electric. They want to buy electric. They've been in one. They know it's a better ride. They know they're going to save money in the long run. And with price parity, those savings really skyrocket. So why are we therefore not allowing these cars in? One of the arguments has been that, they're really dirty. The production of these cars is a problem. This is just not true. This particular graph, which is taken from some work that Bloomberg New Energy Finance put out in response to this criticism, shows on the left-hand side the 2023 values, and on the right-hand side the 2030 values, given the way technology is moving, of both the total emissions from manufacturing and using a gas car. And those are those red lines that you see hovering well above the bars beneath them. And the bars represent the lifetime emissions of electric vehicles, depending on where they're made, broken down by the emissions from making the body, which is the first part of the bar, the emissions from manufacturing the battery, which is that darker purple in the middle, and the emissions from actually driving the EV, which depend on how clean your electricity is. If Canada was on this chart, we would be towards the low end because of the cleanliness of our electricity. We would look a lot like probably the UK looks on the right-hand side. The electric vehicle is a very powerful environmental winner in Canada, partly because our electricity is so low carbon already. And the argument that somehow an electric vehicle from China is an environmental negative simply holds no water. The argument also is, well, they're using slave labor. Now, this is a serious allegation. This picture, by the way, is a Chinese EV manufacturing facility. At least at the point of assembly, from what I've been able to learn about the Chinese electric vehicle industry, the cars are made mainly by robots. And the jobs that occur in those assembly plants are some of the best jobs that a person could get in the Chinese economy. And the companies, by the way, are not government companies. They are private companies. Build Your Dreams is the biggest of the Chinese electric vehicle companies, private company, whatever that means in China. But they're not state-owned. Further up the supply chain, in the mining of the minerals for the batteries, for example, in the places that in the mines that the Chinese now own all over the world for that. Many of them, however, in Australia. A lot of the lithium for the Chinese batteries is coming from Australia, and it's tied to that free trade agreement that I was mentioning earlier. We know that there is forced labor being practiced in China, particularly with respect to the Uyghurs in the Northeast. And we know that it has contaminated the supply chains for a number of industries, including everything from tomato paste to the silicon in solar panels, and to the coal that is mined to make the electricity for doing all kinds of things in the Chinese economy. So, and it's already illegal to import anything into Canada that contains slave labor. It has been for a long time. We've never pursued it. It's very difficult to prove. I don't think there's ever been a single prosecution or case that's gone forward of a company that was caught importing Chinese materials, Chinese imports into Canada because of slave labor being in the supply chain. The onus is really on companies to do their due diligence. The bigger companies do this, but because the issue is so often buried high up in the supply chain, it's a difficult thing to do. I think that obviously we should be taking a strong and principled position against the slave labor anywhere where it's found, whether in China or anywhere else. It doesn't seem to me, however, that a blanket tariff on electric vehicles is the appropriate response. I think the law we have is the appropriate response, and it should be enforced. It should be enforced at a company by company level, and where evidence can be produced that a company is employing slave labor in their supply chains, we already would therefore ban the export of their product into our country. And but we've never enforced that law. And why we would pick electric vehicles suddenly as being the product that we're going to start taking a principled position on is an interesting question to ponder. Because if we're really going to go after slave labor in China, we could have started and should have started some time ago. And you can just take a walk up and down the aisles of Walmart and pick the products that you want to go into. But everything from fabrics to food products have, at least in the past, been implicated with the Uyghur problem. So by itself, it seems to me that the slave labor argument as a reason for, or the forced labor argument, I should really use that term, for using a tariff, a blanket tariff that applies to every company, including General Motors and Tesla and anyone else with factories in China, it just strikes me as a specious argument, or at least a disingenuous argument for supporting rejecting these vehicles from coming into Canada. And there must be some other real reason behind it. Well, another reason that gets put forward is that it's going to hurt Canadian auto workers. I want to take a look at this argument in a little bit of detail. And just by way of context, what you see here is a list of the top selling vehicles in Canada, excuse me, 2023. And the ones that are shaded in red or pink, depending on the color scheme on your monitor, they're made in Canada. The top three of the top four selling vehicles in this country are pickup trucks, by the way. And the Chinese at this point are not really going after that market with their EV output. And number 5 is also a pickup, the Chevy Silverado. We do make those here, but again, I don't think really vulnerable to Chinese EV competition. So of all of the most popular vehicles in Canada that are actually made here, only the Toyota RAV4, the Honda CR-V, and the Honda Civic would be directly exposed to the people making those cars would be directly exposed to a threat from the introduction of Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian retail car market. The fact is that Canadian auto workers do not make cars for Canadians. Only 12% of the output of Canadian auto plants is sold to Canadians. Even that factory in Alliston that makes the Honda Civics, 75% of its output goes to the US. I'll come back to the importance of this fact, but the bottom line is that notwithstanding the Canadian-US-Mexican agreement, the Canadian auto industry is very different from the American auto industry. And therefore, the rationale for and against a prohibitive tariff on Chinese electric vehicles is quite different. In the United States, the Canadian auto industry, which is 10 times bigger than ours, builds cars for Americans. And should the Chinese vehicles come flooding into that country with their lower prices and their high quality, it will be a direct threat to the American auto industry on a scale which is just not true in Canada. We make cars mainly for the American market. Neither is the output of the Canadian auto workers of game-changing importance to the American car industry. About 10% of the cars that are sold in the United States are made in Canada. And that's all those Honda Civics and RAV4s and so on that are made here and shipped to the States. So the retail scene here is that Canadians tend to buy cars that are not built in Canada. I'll come back to that. And I want to just show you, I'm going to get into this a bit. This is a scenario, very summary level information in spite of what looks like a lot of detail here, I'm sure, of some analysis that we've been doing of the impact that allowing or not allowing the Chinese vehicles into Canada would have on a number of indicators. And I took the position, well, what if we assumed that we could allow the Chinese cars in now, that they would be sold at price parity with combustion vehicles, that they would be available over a range of prices that would make electric cars available to millions of Canadian families who right now cannot afford to go into the electric vehicle market because the cars that are being offered to them are too expensive. So we built a scenario where the Chinese would come in now, gradually increase their market share to 20% of sales by 2030, and then hold it there. And what you see in the table of numbers is the top line is just the total sales of new vehicles in Canada that's assumed in this scenario. The middle column is 2030 and the right-hand column is 2035. You can see the 20% market share on the second line. This leads to sales of Chinese electric vehicles totaling the numbers you see, so 379,000 by 2035 that year. Excuse me. The cumulative number of Chinese electric vehicles that would be in Canada by 2035 under this scenario would be 3.2 million. So that would be around 12% of the cars in Canada. So that would mean that the share of Chinese electric vehicles on the road by 2035 in this country would be somewhere around where the share of, well, it'd be around 13%, 3 million out of what by then would be somewhere around 27 million vehicles. The next row is the savings in fuel and maintenance that the families that bought these vehicles would save every year after deducting what they would have to pay for the electricity to run the vehicles. So it would be up to $8.2 billion a year by 2035. The next line is the impact that this would have on greenhouse gas emissions. And by the way, the counterfactual case here is that these are cars that are being purchased by families that would otherwise have to buy a combustion vehicle for the reasons that I was going over just a moment ago. So we would have net annual GHG reduction benefits of 10.6 million tons by 2035. And then the next three lines just show what this adds up to on a cumulative basis by 2035. The utility revenue line is interesting. It's not included in the first set of numbers, but this would represent $6.7 billion in utility revenue, and they need this. The utilities in this country are facing an enormous transition to make the move to an electric grid that will be running on distributed and renewable resources, and which will be supporting the electrification of buildings and transportation, and accelerating the uptake of electric vehicles in this country is one way to start generating the cash flow that can help support the billions of dollars of capital investment, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds really, if you get it up to the whole scenario, that are going to have to be put into our electricity sector in order to get through this transition. What about the impact on auto workers? There's a bit of a side calculation in the second half of this chart. I look at the percent of vehicles that are produced in Canada that are actually sold here. So that's that 12% number. This gives you the number of Canadian-made light vehicles sold in Canada year by year. So 239,000 by 2035 in this scenario. The estimated share that's exposed to Chinese competition, so taking the pickup trucks out, is only about 3/4 of that, for the reasons that I was showing earlier in terms of where the popular made in Canada vehicles are. And so really the share of Canadian production that is vulnerable to in this particular scenario is less than 2%. And the auto workers, there's about 135,000 auto workers, and a lot of those are in the parts industry, and I'll say a word about that in a moment. And if you assume that the 1.8% that was vulnerable was completely captured by the Chinese vehicles, then you're talking about 2,400 auto worker jobs being exposed, about obviously the same percentage, about 1.8% of the workforce in that industry. And it would be a lower percentage if you assume growth in the number of auto workers. I've assumed that they will become more productive, and they will go from producing 1.7 million to 1.9 million vehicles without increasing the workforce. So yes, and when you add in the impact of parts, including parts made in Canada that are sold to American companies that end up in cars that are sold back to Canadians, that end up getting lost to Chinese competition, it hardly moves the needle at all. That's a fairly detailed analysis. I'm not going to go into it, but I did look at the impact of parts, and it doesn't really budge this conclusion very much, that the quantitative number of Canadian auto workers that would be affected by the Chinese coming in with these cars and selling up to 20% of new vehicle sales over this next critical decade in terms of our climate change response would be quite minimal. And if you look at the just the savings that the families that bought those cars would accrue over that period, the $41 billion by 2035, or the even just take the $8 billion per year and divide that by the 2,400 auto worker jobs that are vulnerable, you can see that you're spending millions of dollars per auto worker to save that job. I mean, it's only a thought experiment, but I think it exposes the disingenuousness of arguing that somehow imposing 100% tariff on letting Chinese cars be sold into Canada in our retail car market is a threat to auto workers. Some people also say, well, we have to have the same tariff as the United States. We do not. That's just simply not true. There is nothing in the Canadian, US, Mexican Auto Pact that specifies or restricts what any member of the pact can charge a non-party to the treaty in terms of tariffs. We have different tariffs in Canada than Mexico and the United States for a number of products, including up until this Chinese issue, cars itself. So it is not uncommon for the three countries in the pact to have their own and differentiated tariffs that they're applying to stuff that's coming in from outside of the auto pact. We would have to obviously have ways to restrict any cars that came into Canada from being resold into the US. But this is not like a cell phone. It's pretty hard to sneak a car across the border. And it seems to me quite a manageable task to prevent any Chinese vehicles that were sold into Canada from being sold in the secondhand market or any other market for that matter in the United States. So I don't buy the argument that the tariff is legally required, and I don't buy the argument that it would be an effective protection against auto worker jobs. And I don't think it makes any sense to argue that these vehicles are an environmental threat. And I've also addressed the the forced labor argument, where it just seems to me the tariff is absolutely the wrong tool. We already have a law for dealing with that. We should be enforcing it. So I just think that it comes down to a political decision to align with the United States because of some sort of sense that China is a big bad country, and we have to support our American friends and trading partners in their battle, in their trade war with China. And that's a perfectly, I shouldn't say perfectly, but that's a legitimate position for a Canadian to take. But we should have our eyes open that this is a very, very expensive decision that we are making by imposing this tariff. We are essentially taxing taxing Canadian car buyers and penalizing Canadian canola growers in order to protect the American auto industry, not the Canadian auto industry, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of lost economic gain for Canada that we are turning our back on. Never mind the fact that this will make it virtually impossible for us to meet our 2035 target of 100% of personal vehicles in this country being emission free. If you look at this table again, and you look at the cumulative Chinese electric vehicles in 2035 at 3.2 million, there's more than 20 million other vehicles in 2035 that are going to have to be electric that are not Chinese in this scenario. And you could double these numbers and still not and still have a challenge in front of you for meeting that 2035 target. It's actually a sales target, I should say. So the relevant number to compare is the 379,000 vehicles in column 2035. It's still a relatively small share of Canadian vehicle sales in 2035. So I think we could use the help that the introduction of these vehicles would bring to meeting our greenhouse gas targets. I think it would be an economic boon to Canadian families who would respend those savings in their local economies. I think it would be a welcome revenue growth number for Canadian utilities. And I think that the tariff, therefore, in my view, is a mistake. And I'll leave it at that. I've talked long enough. The last slide simply has a number of other links to materials and other opinions for those of you who want to go deeper on this issue. And these can be pursued with the version of the slides that will be made available by CACOR after today's session. Thank you. I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ralph. So if anybody has any questions on that they would like to ask of Ralph, there's a few of them in the chat, but if you have other questions, there certainly is time for other questions. As the person introducing you, I get the privilege of asking the first question. And actually, a couple of comments. If you look at your numbers, the estimate that I did per job is that it's $17 million of costs per job, and that's costs that are incurred by Canadian families, right? And if you look at the GHG emissions, it's 22,000 tons of GHG emissions per job. And for those who've seen numbers before that we discuss, the rule of thumb is that about 1,000 tons of GHG emission results in essentially one death per year. So it's a huge impact, right? So a few different things here that I want to ask, and we'll go also to the other question. So I'm concerned about the equity point of view here, and if you think about Uber drivers or people who are delivering Amazon packages and all that, and might be looking to reduce their operational costs by driving electric, what do you see as the impact on those groups of people from these tariffs?
Well, I mean, like everybody, it means that they're going to have to pay more for an electric vehicle than they otherwise would. They may be more likely to go ahead than would a typical Canadian family whose car is parked 95% of the time, and who maybe only puts maybe 15 or 17,000 kilometers on that vehicle in a year. If you're a commercial driver, the life cycle advantages of going electric amplify according to how much you drive it, because every kilometer is a savings over driving a fuel-powered vehicle. So simply put, I think I was just in Montreal a couple of weeks ago and was in an Uber, and it was a big Toyota SUV electric vehicle. Must have cost the guy a fortune, but he said no, it made sense given the amount of time that he spent in it. He would be much better off if he could have bought a Chinese EV, because he would have saved at the front end. But I think for Uber drivers, and if they've got the capital, and this is an issue, but if you can afford to buy an electric vehicle and you're a commercial driver putting in 25 or 30,000 kilometers, for example, a year on your vehicle, the business case is just very, very strong, even at the prices that prevail in the Western EV market right now.
Okay, thanks. So I forgot to have some people prepared to ask their questions. So Richard, you had a question about talking about the increase in the number of charging stations. And to that point, actually, Ralph, you're probably aware that Dunsky had a report that indicates that Canada will need about 700,000 public charging stations by, I believe it's 2035. Any comments on that and the increase there? And then on deck, we'll have Peter McKinnon.
Yeah, I think that I hope we need that many. If we do, that would be a sign that we're on track to meeting our electrification goals. We have been looking at that. The cost, the capital cost of the charging network is quite a lot smaller than the capital cost of the vehicles themselves. I think we've got it at about a total of $30 billion to get into that same range that Dunsky is talking about. I think we were somewhere around 550,000 public chargers by compared to the 700,000. A lot depends on what happens in the charging network in multifamily dwellings, if they're counting that as part of their public charging total or not. But I would say that the capital cost of the enabling infrastructure for electrification is not a fundamental barrier to getting on with it. The problem is that who's going to make those investments. Right now, the government has been taking the lead. We included it in our analysis. We assume everybody who buys a vehicle is going to have a home charger for starters, but we have got about a $30 billion scenario in there for public chargers. And I think government really has to take the lead on making sure that investment happens, because if people don't have confidence that the charging network is going to be there, then even if the vehicles are affordable, they're going to balk at going electric in the showroom. And every decision to buy a fossil car is, locks us into those greenhouse gas emissions for the next 15 years or so, given how long cars are staying on the road. So it's really urgent that people have confidence when they go to make that purchasing decision that availability of charging infrastructure is never going to be a problem.
Okay. Peter, you had a question?
Yes,
And
I
actually-
do. I'll just activate my imagery here. I posted a comment in the chat, and it was related to your early presentation, Ralph, about the energy distribution in our economy. So it was a big question in that context. I know you got into much more specific details about even costs of cars, but I was wondering in the sense of all this energy. I noted like 24% was commercial buildings, 24% was residential buildings. That's 24%, 12 each. That's 24% right there of greenhouse gas emissions. That was the largest group of the total segments you've got there as you lump the two together. And of course, all the other things, many manufacturing and other sources of things are also created in cities. So cities are the source of the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions, like at least 60%. And other estimates go even into the 70s. So I'm just wondering, in any prognosis you've done, and of course, even introducing electrification for electric cars is part of this part of the solution to this problem you were just talking about. But what can be done for cities to give them some more power to help deal with this rather complex environment that they operate in, public-private partnerships of all sorts, and independent walls of collaboration?
Well, it's a big question, or at least the answer is quite big. We're in the middle of a project here at Corporate Knights called Climate Dollars, in which we are systematically evaluating the capital cost requirements to decarbonize the Canadian economy sector by sector. And we've come to the same conclusion you have, that much of this comes down to a transformation that needs to take place in our cities, in the grid, and in the buildings, and in the transportation sector. And they are interconnected now. The electrification of buildings and the electrification of vehicles connects those two sectors to the local distribution grid and the local electricity supply in a way that has never been true historically. It's a whole new ballgame. And we've got regulatory structures, for example, in our electricity sector, that almost guarantee we're going to mess this up, because you have opportunities to invest in everything from vehicle to grid infrastructure in buildings, to efficiency and peak saving measures, which have internal rates of return, which are not necessarily attractive to the building owner, but which might be to a public utility that's operating with 3% or 4% cheaper capital. So one very specific answer to your question is that the regulatory mandates and the utility mandates in this country need to be revised with a focus on low carbon. And we need to be able to get public money, in other words, low interest, long-term money, whether it's public utility investment or other types of public sector investment, applied to the problem of decarbonizing the buildings in our cities, including the residential buildings, and to decarbonizing and putting in place that charging infrastructure, and to supporting the development of the new local electricity grid. And we're actually working with a small group now to try and move that agenda forward. Cities are also able to do quite a bit because they control so many of the levers that when it comes to buildings, by way of building standards, if you look at what Toronto is doing, that can sort of force the investment towards the green building end of the spectrum. And we're going to see a lot more of that. So cities need to just take control. There's a lot they can do without waiting for the provincial or the federal government to come to their assistance. And we're seeing examples of that all over the world where cities are taking initiative. But yeah, this is the electric city that's coming is very different in so many ways from the city of the 20th century.
Mhm.
And it's going to
Or
be
any century before.
yeah.
I agree with your observation that cities will have an influence, certainly, for example, on builders, constructors who build large complexes, maybe have new homes, for instance, or new residential complexes. And then, in fact, there's some examples of that here in Ottawa. But they still have so little actual power to raise revenue. I mean, they can impose, tax rates and, fines, and that's about it. They can charge for public events, but, it's pretty small pittance compared to what, say, a national or a provincial government has in terms of a percentage of what they have to spend on things versus a city, which is where the nexus of everything is going on. I mean, they're not even represented at the COPE tables.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for your comments and your presentation.
I mean, we could do a whole afternoon on that question that you've just raised. There's constitutional element to it. There's a lot that cities can do without requiring a change in their legal status vis-a-vis spending. And some of them are going ahead and doing it using fees and permits. But yeah, they're fundamentally constrained at some point when it comes to capital financing. And that's going to have to change, or we're going to have to find creative ways around it, perhaps through the use of the public utilities to up the decarbonization investment in cities. And we need to do it really soon.
Is this something your institute has done any research in?
Yes.
Or considering doing so?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. I'll look out.
I'm biting my tongue because I spent 10 years of my life working with cities on these issues. And if I start talking about it, we'll be here till 6 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Ralph. Well, I've been working on cities for quite a while too, so we'll get offline on this. Thank you.
Okay, that'd be great.
So next question is Richard, and then we'll have Ted Manning on deck.
Thanks, Raymond. Ralph, that was a great talk. Thank you. I support everything you said. And just the one thing question, in your cost calculations, I'm just wondering if you took into account also the reduced need for insurance due to climate change when you escalate the number of EVs. Right now, there are a lot of properties that are becoming uninsurable, or the insurance rates are going up so much. And on top of that, there's the benefits in terms of health and the cost of the health care of people who are affected by climate change and emissions and so forth. I can go on at length about that. But don't expect anything to happen if Poilievre gets elected. I rewrote an article and published on that this summer. Jeff Strong and I did, and it just don't expect anything beneficial to happen if Poilievre gets elected. He doesn't believe climate change exists and is tied to the fossil fuel industry, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, the one comment I would make about the insurance question is that the frequency and the severity of the extreme weather events, which are causing the insurance companies so much grief these days, is pretty well locked in for some time to come now. The weather that we're going to get is the result of the emissions that are already up in the atmosphere. And so it's difficult to make it would be difficult to calculate how much one individual's electric vehicle insurance premium should be different because of the fact that at some point in the future, there might be fewer hurricanes. However, as an incentive, it may have a lot to say for it. And there are some insurance companies that are actually getting quite proactive in some of the measures that they're taking for both. They're just no longer insuring fossil fuel production, including some of the biggest. I believe Munich Re is right out now. And secondly, they are trying to come up with financial instruments of various sorts to encourage acceleration of the low carbon options. And yeah, the insurance industry was the very first industry in the private sector back in I think they came to the Berlin Climate Conference in 1995 with Greenpeace as their Greenpeace UK had actually gone to the insurance industry in the mid-90s and said, you guys need to start working on climate policy because that's really going to hurt. And they were already feeling it by then.
Yeah.
So they're way out in front, I would say, in general, in terms of both accepting the reality because they're writing the checks and coming up with creative solutions for dealing with it. And you could do a whole CACOR session on what's going on there. It would be quite fascinating. As far as conservative politics, it's interesting because the environmental issue, it wasn't always polarized like this, like so many things, I guess you could say. When you look back at the Mulroney era here in Canada, or right-wing and conservative leaders like even Reagan, Schwarzenegger, Thatcher, they all actually had pro-environmental policies in their own way. All of that's gone now. And we have this sort of bizarre and tragic polarization that's developed around environmental issues that is not going to end well. And we've been, one of the things Corporate Knights has been doing, in fact, we published an issue this past year. Some of you may have seen that the cover had a base cap on it, and the words embroidered on the top were "Make conservatives green again." And we invited a UK and an American and a Canadian conservative to make the case for why they need to be returning to a sort of a pro-environmental protection stance and putting forward conservative policies that would align with that. And I'm still hopeful we may see that. It's not great right now to look what's happening with conservative politics, but there is a fundamental case for conservative politics to be pro-environment. There always has been. The word conservation itself is linked to conservatism, and it's really one of the tragedies of our time is the fact that something like environmental protection has become a partisan issue.
Well, that's the point we make in the article, is that 400 times in a row, Poilievre has voted against anything that was pro-environment. 400 times in a row. And never, in very rare instances, did he ever vote for anything that was pro-environment.
Yeah.
So it's pretty sad. Anyway, thank you so much for your talk. And I mean, there's lots we could talk about. I'd love to talk to you more, actually. But anyway, we'll let others ask questions.
Okay, so Art, you'll be on deck, and Ted, your question about BYD is a question that I wanted to ask, but I'll let you ask it.
Yeah, well, I stole it. By the way, Ralph, thank you very much. I very much enjoy listening to you previously and now. We've worked together at least once in the past. But what I think you have highlighted is that selfishness is the prime directive, and that whether it's in government or corporations or personal, in terms of whether I buy SUV or an EV or whatever at this point. It comes right back to what I have today in my pocket, and to hell with the planet and to hell with anyone else. Now, that the two questions I have here, I'll put them both together, is by and large, we are trying to be selfish to make sure that other people do not win. And therefore, making Chinese vehicles evil just because they're not ours seems to me to be a rather short-sighted thing, as you have pointed out. I'm just wondering, is there enough flexibility in the system to allow us to joint venture with them in the creation of the same kind of factories that we have for Toyotas or for Hondas? Or are we so blind to this that we are going to shoot ourselves in the foot just as a matter of principle? And I'm following a second question, which is also coming back to who wins, is why hasn't the fossil fuel industry, through its gas station system, begun to put in its own charging stations so that it can profit as the transition happens?
Well, I mean, some gas stations have got electric chargers. I think that most people are going to charge their electric vehicle. Most people do charge their electric vehicle at home most of the time. I don't think it's going to be like the gas vehicle era where you would fill up a tank, charge up a battery, and then run it down till it was almost empty and then fill it up again. That reality fundamentally creates a business case for the filling station, which is a depot with lots of fuel where you can go once every week or 2 weeks and fill the tank up. I think with electric vehicles, they're going to be topped up all the time. In fact, I think we may look back at the electric vehicle as being more important for introducing portable batteries to our electricity system than anything else. And where people are going to want to charge is going to be wherever their vehicle is parked. And so I don't think it lends itself to the filling station approach so much as to an approach where there's a widely distributed network of public chargers just about everywhere, whether you're at work.
No, I have an electric vehicle myself. I've had it for a couple of months, and you're right. I charge it at home, except when I'm 500 kilometers from home. And therefore, you begin to look for where there are predictable places that you could charge quickly. And it strikes me that the gas stations along major highways would be a very logical place where you would be able to stop predictably, eat, pee, and then get back in your car.
Absolutely. Yeah, that the highways have to have lots of charging stations.
But for local, I mean, I do charge it at home, and it's wonderful.
And you need to have lots of stations. I mean, I had a friend who drove his Tesla back from Montreal last weekend, and he had to wait an hour. There are chargers along the way at the highway stations on the 401, but they were all occupied and they all had lineups. So we're getting into that very a situation you really want to avoid, where the supply of charging capability is not keeping up with the growth of the vehicle population. And on a long weekend or a particularly busy period, we're now starting to see lineups at the chargers, even at those highway stations that maybe have half a dozen chargers. It's not enough. So I
know. I was trying to plan a run down to New York City for a conference, and it was very difficult to plan it because you have to pick a couple of places to fill in a rush. And
on the question of whether on the question of whether we might eventually see Chinese car manufacturing plants in Canada, I actually think that by letting them sell their cars here now, we might be in a better position to see that day than by worsening our relations with them the way we are by putting this tariff in place. There never has and probably never will be a car company that builds a plant in Canada unless it can sell cars to the United States. Our market is just too small. And
Yeah.
in that sense, I think that the question really becomes, in a future where Chinese vehicles can be sold in the United States,
Mhm.
might we have a piece of that action here in Canada? And I suppose going along with the Americans right now on this tariff could be argued either way on that question, as whether that might better position us over the long term as a location. The Chinese do have assembly plants in Mexico.
Yeah.
They're building, and they're part of the pact, and those cars
Mhm.
are being built for Mexicans. And they're also being built for the South American market, which the Chinese are aggressively going after. They're not being built for Americans, obviously. They're not allowed to sell them into America. But I think that we could probably, like Mexico, it would be, certainly in our interest if we could see the day when these cars are being built here, because frankly, and you'll see it if you read some of those extra materials that I included links to about what's going on in Europe. Chinese have kind of won this one. They figured out how to do this, and they're everywhere, every market they're entering, they're taking by storm. And so I don't think trying to build a wall around North America, I don't even think it's good for the competitive position of the North American car market, not in the long run. We need to figure out how to build cars as well and as cheaply as they do, or I should say as least expensively as they do, as efficiently as they do. And we need to build partnerships with them. Our car companies need to be partnering with them, as many of them are, by the way. Like Mercedes-Benz, General Motors, they're all in China. Tesla's in China.
Yep.
And so it's coming. And you'll see when you read some of this material that the car executives in Europe themselves are quite divided on the advisability of trying to shut out the Chinese cars with tariff mechanisms. And this is a really complicated issue for them.
Could do a
General
whole
Motors is in
session
the
just
paper.
on trade one day. We can maybe set that up. Anyway, thank you very much, Ralph. That
Yeah,
was excellent.
okay, Ted.
Okay, so
Thanks, Ted.
we have about 10 minutes left. Let's try to get through a few more questions. So John Hollins, can you be on deck? And Art, it's your turn.
Okay, I think most of you know that I have a microgrid. I charge at home, and I use solar and home batteries in my microgrid, and I run it as a virtual power plant, and trying to follow exactly what is happening in other jurisdictions around the world, including in China and the US. California is really well ahead in doing this, as well as Texas and some activity in New York. And of course, I have spent a lot of time over these last several months looking at grid modernization and what's happening around the world in the grids to address this demand growth due to electrifying everything. And that, of course, includes home thermal comfort industry, including the big AI processing sites that are being addressed now, as well as transportation, particularly not just looking at automobiles, but Class 8 trucks. There's a lot of work going on in that field, and I'm just wondering if you've looked at things like what the IESO policy has brought in under direction from the Ontario Energy Board with the ultra-low overnight rates, which is to move peak loads into the overnight. And in fact, I've been running in this mode, and at this stage, I'm paying nothing to electrify everything that I have control of, and that's my 2 EVs and my house. I just pay grid connect fees. have you taken, as corporate knights, taken a look at any of this? And perhaps I should send you some of the material that I use and give presentations to.
Yeah, love to see any of that material, Art. It is, Ontario electricity has been a lifelong interest of mine. As you may know, I got involved with the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning in 1976. And that was when I started down the road of interest in these issues. So I've maintained an interest over the years in Ontario electricity, and would be happy to engage further with you. I'm following very closely the evolution of thinking at the IESO, and particularly with regard to how they're approaching electrification of buildings and transportation, and what it means to the long-term outlook for the Ontario system.
Yeah. Okay, I'll send you my deck and we can discuss this offline.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So Dave Doherty, you're on deck, and John Hollins, your turn.
Good, thank you. Ralph, nice to see you. And
Hi, John.
thank you in particular for something that you said really early on as part of the context, which has struck me for quite a long time, but I've never ever before seen the kinds of emissions allocation that you made to end-use sectors and end-use jurisdictions. Some members of CACOR and most members of environmental organizations that I know are adamant in their attacks on the fossil fuel industry. And I understand that. If there was no fossil fuel industry in Canada, there would be no fossil fuels produced, and therefore we wouldn't get charged as a country with all those emissions from Fort McMurray and Alberta in particular. But I'm always taken to my vague memories of the Eaton's department store. They survived, they prospered for more than a century. But around the end, in the late 1990s, they collapsed in a heap on the floor. They didn't collapse because they didn't have anything to sell. They collapsed because their clients stopped buying stuff from them. So it's always seemed to me that those who buy gasoline and natural gas and coal are in fact responsible for the emissions in their production. Do you see it that way, or have I missed something?
Well, excuse me. I mean, I think there's a fundamental truth to it, but you take the electric vehicle example. If you're a Canadian family and you've got $35,000 budget to buy a new car, what are you going to do? You may want to go electric, but it's just not, there's just not going to be an option available to you. So can you really blame them for buying another fossil car? And so I think there's a lot of nuances to the general position you're putting forward, which is, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted are the result of individual household and individuals and firms' combustion of fossil fuels. But having said that, everybody's living and working within a political and cultural and economic framework which restricts their options sometimes for making the kind of change that we need away from fossil fuels. And we see this problem, and it becomes an equity problem, because the transition to a zero carbon future, which is largely about the transition to an electric future, is very capital intensive. And if you have capital, you can do it. You can retrofit your house, you can buy the electric vehicle, but if you don't, you're stuck. And it's one of these central implementation problems facing the transition to low carbon, is how do we ensure that this is an equitable transition and that everybody has the ability to make this as we go along. Otherwise, everywhere from the capital requirements of the natural gas industry and all the way through the economy, an increasing amount of the cost of maintaining those legacy systems is going to fall on a shrinking client base made up of the people who could not afford to get off because they didn't have access to the capital. So it's a wicked problem.
Indeed. I remember that you and Toby Heaps had an opinion published in the Globe and Mail many months ago. I've forgotten exactly what it was about. But is this a topic that would be worth you or somebody in CACOR trying to write an opinion piece? Because I quite often get letters published in the Ottawa Citizen and the Globe and Mail, as does Richard van der Riet, for example. This is one of the very few tools that ordinary citizens have to try to share what we understand, what we even know, with the force of Canadian politics.
Yeah, I mean, we do try to publish in forums like that and have some success. And if your question is, would it be good to publish what the emissions distribution looks like when you spread it around?
No,
according to
my point would be stop. The message I would want to send was, it's up to us all as citizens and people running corporations what we burn, what fossil fuels we burn, one way or another. It's not the people who produce those fuels or make electricity with them. They're responsible. They're responding to a market demand.
Yeah. But at the same time, if you look at the record of the fossil fuel industry over the years in denying the reality of this problem and deliberately covering up the science in so many ways, blocking attempts by civil society to accelerate the pace of the transition to a cleaner and more sustainable future, they don't come out of that smelling like roses. So I accept your basic premise, of course, and we have to deal with consumerism too. Underneath all of this is the question of can we maintain growth and indefinitely, even as we decarbonize. So there's lots of responsibility to spread around, and I don't. As you know, I take a bottom-up approach to all of the work that I do. So I start with the demand at the very granular level, but I don't necessarily assume that each individual household has the agency right now and the ability to make the transition, because they're locked into an economic and a policy environment which can make it difficult for them to do it.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the formal recorded session. So we'll ask Dave to ask his question and thank the speaker. And also after that, I see Rick Carpenter and Charlie Hall have some questions. Ralph, if you have a bit of time after and you want to stay, we could get to those questions. Okay.
I just want to say, Ralph, that I thought that the answer you just gave was very good. People are locked into many of the behaviors that they find themselves doing. We're all under the influence, as that CBC program said. But worse than that, we will literally starve if we cannot, for example, get to work. And when they keep ruining what we did establish as public transit and making it more and more expensive, people are going to have to fall back to buying a beater car with an ICE engine, because they can't afford. They're trying to convince me that $65,000 for a car is affordable. That's ridiculous. I need a car that's going to cost me around $20,000. Full stop. My first question is this one. And there's a guy who's trying to style himself as the supporter of the ordinary guy who needs a $20,000 car. So do you expect that a change in government would result in the reversal of the tariff is my first question. I have a second one. Please make that answer short.
No, I don't think that there'd be a reversal of the tariff. And I think Polylev was on record as supporting it, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, well, that just to me shows, as you so eloquently argued, the economic conservative stance is we should not have that tariff. It just indicates to me that he's not the guy who should be running this country. My second question is this, and it's a much broader one. There seem to be indications that EV makers are wallowing around the world. For example, VW looks like it's set to fail. It's got one big EV factory that it seems ready to shut down. How might it be possible to get the transportation of road travel worldwide? Are we looking at, well, we're going to have to rely on the Chinese to do it all?
Maybe. I mean, China has become the factory of the world right now, hasn't it? It may be that that's where our cars will be coming from. Same place our cell phones come from and so many other things. It won't stay that way forever.
My kitchen.
But,
everything in my kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what a strange world it is into which we have come. Yeah, I wanted to thank you on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. It was a wonderful talk today, a unique analysis, something that we should have had a long time ago, frankly. This whole idea of attributing emissions where they actually occur, I think is really important. I think maybe Charlie Hall was trying to make a comment earlier, and it probably is related to this. You know, the United States has been able to save its economy over the last 30 years or so only because of fracking and the importation of oil from Canada. Anyway, so thank you once again. I hope we'll be able to get you back. I want to share the end slide here. Just a moment. Trying to do two things at once is always confusing. Okay, so there we are. Canadian Association for the Club of Rome welcomes everybody to these weekly presentations. You can see our material on YouTube, and you can see our material on our website. There's a huge amount of reading that you can undertake at your leisure at any time. It no longer includes X for various reasons, despite the fact that many of the people in our organization probably drive Tesla cars. So if you wish to subscribe, that'd be great. We look forward to seeing you come back to future programs. Thank you.